Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. Now, here's a disturbing figure. So far this year, at least 43 journalists have been killed. I'm going to repeat that number, 43. The most recent and notable being Saudi commentator Jamal Khashoggi. The US, once seen as a beacon of press freedom, is also changing its tone, with President Donald Trump calling journalists the enemy of the people. Reporters who just want to do their jobs are finding that increasingly difficult in many parts of the world, and nobody knows that better than Peter Greste, the Australian journalist who found himself in an Egyptian jail for more than 400 days. His horrific experience forms the basis for his book, The First Casualty, a memoir from the front lines of the global war on journalism that's also just been published in French, and he joins me in the studio today. Thank you so much, Peter, for coming in.
Fantastic to be here.
We talk about attacks on press freedom today, but in fact, you say this all began after 9/11, and especially with the death of Daniel Pearl.
Yeah, it's not so much that that was the very beginning, the first point that journalists ever started being attacked, but let's think about what happened around 9/11. Before 9/11, what we saw were wars over tangible things, the kind of things that you could put your finger on, like land or water or ethnicity. But 9/11 was a conflict over ideas. And in that conflict over ideas, journalists suddenly move from being simply observers, as they were in those wars of the past, to being participants. In a war of ideas, the place where ideas are transmitted, which is the media, the sort of environment that you and I work in, that becomes a part of the battlefield. And so what 9/11 did was create this war of ideas where journalists are suddenly seen as legitimate targets by both the governments and the extremists on both sides. George W. Bush famously said, of course, at a joint session of Congress soon after 9/11, he said, "In this war on terror, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists." That made it a binary choice. You could either be on one side of the line or the other. But if you do what journalists are supposed to do and interrogate all of the parties to a conflict or a dispute, you cross the line. And in the eyes of George W. Bush, you became part of the enemy.
And you know that very well, and I'm just going to bring it back to what happened to you for the viewers who might not be that familiar. You yourself were a target. You ended up in jail, arrested under the accusation of allegedly in the process damaging Egyptian national security. You were thrown into solitary confinement without charge. You were subsequently tried with your Al Jazeera colleagues, sentenced to 7 years in jail, then released, as were your colleagues. That was clearly, reading the book, a frightening time. How did you manage to keep sane?
It's strange, isn't it? You know, one of the things that you realise when you go into prison is that the whole experience is designed to mess with your head. We weren't being physically abused. Fortunately, the amount of international attention and pressure that we had, I think, spared us some of the worst excesses of the Egyptian prison system. We had food. It wasn't always great food, but it was basic nutrition. We had water and we had shelter, the basic things that you need for survival. And in that environment, you realise very quickly that physically you're okay. The greatest danger then becomes your own head. And so you have to maintain a very strong sense of perspective. You have to maintain a strong sense of daily rhythm and discipline over your daily life. You have to exercise. You have to be physically active and tired at the end of the day, even if you're in a very small, confined space, as I was in solitary confinement. You've got to stay mentally active and focused, so you have to create mental activities for yourself. And you also need to stay spiritually very grounded. You need to maintain a sense of purpose and a sense of self-awareness. It's not easy. But once you understand that that is your primary job, that's your main responsibility, is looking after your own psychology, then you can kind of develop strategies that work.
How has it changed you as a result?
In all sorts of ways, you know. I know that most people who hear my story at some point ask themselves the same question. That is, how would I cope if I was in his position? And I know if I was sitting where you are now, I'd be saying, well, I couldn't deal with 4 days, much less 400. I'm lucky that I had the chance to find out just how far my limits were. I don't say that facetiously. I think that I'm far stronger than I ever thought possible. I think most people are. I just don't think most people have the opportunity that I had to discover just where those limits
Do you
are.
think an Australian sense of humour helped at times?
Yeah, perhaps that does, an Australian irreverence maybe.
I want to broaden our conversation out a bit and ask you, why are journalists the object of so much hatred? Why is it that we're not seen to be on the side of people?
It's a really good question, and I wish I had a magic answer for you. A whole bunch of factors have happened. The main one, I think, is the digital disruption, which has opened up a whole raft of other sources. And, remember in the early days of the internet, it was supposed to democratise information, it was supposed to liberate information, it was supposed to make us all far more better informed and far better connected. But one of the things that we've learned is that quantity is not the same as quality. And in the end, what we've got is a lot of digital noise, a lot of informational noise, which simply muddies the waters. And it makes it much easier for people to pick and choose whichever pieces of information, whatever stories they like, whatever stories confirm to their own worldviews. And that means disregarding any quality journalism that might be seen as challenging your own way of seeing things.
But isn't that where we can pitch ourselves as we are the professionals who are able to sort out the wheat from the chaff? This is why we exist.
Yeah, and it's really important that we underline that fact and underline the really fundamental role that journalism plays in a democracy. And I know I don't want to sound like I'm patronising people, but one of the things that we tend to forget is just how important journalism is to a democracy. Remember, we hire the politicians, they work for us, and we pay their wages. And as their employers, it's really vital that we know what our employees are doing in our names. And the way in which we do that is through good journalism. If we didn't have good journalism, all we'd have is communication by Facebook posts and tweets. And I think we've all learned by now that alone isn't really enough to know what our politicians are really up to. We need good journalism to hold them to account.
And as you say, the electorate has forgotten the power dynamic, haven't they, as a result?
Yeah, I think they have. And we need to fight back. That's not to say that journalists aren't responsible to a certain extent. We've lost, in our struggle to stay alive, in our struggle for financial success, and we've allowed I think a lot of our professional standards to slip. We tend to prioritise speed over accuracy now. We tend to be more tabloid, and we tend to go for the kinds of stories that generate clicks, and those aren't necessarily the kinds of stories that we would consider to be quality journalism. And that means that we've lost some of that public confidence that we had. And I think we need to hold that line, even if it means sometimes taking decisions that aren't quite as commercially successful.
You're talking there about social media and digital media, but if you go back to the nature of television news coverage, especially with the rise of 24-hour news networks like this one, but say also in countries such as Russia, China and Turkey. I mean, you yourself were working for the Qatari-funded Al Jazeera. In your opinion, what can be considered as a reliable news source?
I think we've all got to recognise that journalism is a fundamentally human construct, and you see the world from wherever you happen to sit. When you're sitting here in Paris, you have a French view of the universe. When you're sitting in London or New York, you have a very Anglo-centric view of the world. If you're sitting in Qatar, those are the lenses through which you see the world. And the decisions that you make, the editorial decisions, are all prioritised around that particular lens. That doesn't mean that any one is right or wrong. But as viewers, you have a responsibility, and readers and consumers of news all have a responsibility to look for news services that are based on quality journalism. You can make your own choices about what works and what doesn't, but also make sure you have a range of views. That's the only way to do it.
Education is key. Education is key,
exactly.
Do you despair for the future of journalism as a result?
I'm worried about it. I'm very deeply concerned about it. But I think despair is too strong a word. I think we're in a period of transition, a very dynamic transition. Nobody can honestly say what the world of journalism and the media is going to look like in the near future. Anyone who tells you that they've got a clear sense of what that might be is lying. But it is going to settle down. It has to stabilise into some new form of dynamics. The thing is that if we simply allow it to unfold without some kind of direction, then the chances are we'll end up with a result that's counterproductive and possibly destructive, particularly not just for journalism but to our whole democracy. So we need to take leadership. We need to really decide what it is that we need our journalism to do, and then make sure that we design a system that delivers that outcome.
And can you give some examples of concrete steps that you believe need to be taken in order for that to happen?
Well, I think, in fact, we're actually starting to do this. My new job is as a professor of journalism and communication at the University of Queensland, and that means I've got the chance to conduct a lot of research. And what we're doing is looking at the very basis of the system that journalism operates in, not just trying to find business models that work for journalism, but try to say that the environment, the pool in which it's operating in, is no longer fit for purpose. It doesn't really deliver good journalism. It doesn't help our democracy. It's designed by engineers, computer scientists to generate clicks and generate revenue for companies in Silicon Valley. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy here, but the point is that the environment isn't designed to help good journalism and good democratic debate. And so we need to think about how to restructure that. I still don't have any clear answers just yet, but that's where we need to start looking.
And as you say, you're now a university professor working with young aspiring journalists. What piece of advice do you give them?
I say that you cannot be in this business now unless you have a passion for it, unless you feel a sense of mission and purpose. It's not an easy business to be in. Anyone who's tried to...
I was going to say they only have to look at your life.
Yeah,
Peter.
exactly. Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm the best example for students, but and certainly not for their parents. But you've got to be prepared to tough it out, and you've got to have a sense of commitment to it. If you've got a sense of curiosity about the world, and a sort of sense of toughness and grit and resilience, then I think it's the best job in the world.
I have to say I agree with you. Peter Greste, it's been great speaking to you.
It's been a real pleasure.
And that's it for the France 24 interview. Do stay with us because there'll be more news and headlines coming up very shortly.